In the year 1886, on the raw, wind-scoured edge of Redemption Gulch, Arthur Blackwood's life had been hammered into a shape of brutal simplicity. It was a life measured not in days or seasons, but in the rhythmic clang of his hammer against hot iron, a sound that began with the pale grey of dawn and ended long after the sky had bruised into a star-flecked night. His forge was his world, a cavern of sweat, soot, and searing heat, and he was its solitary, grim monarch. The fire that burned in the hearth was a tamed and useful thing, unlike the one that had hollowed him out 4 years prior, the one that had consumed his small cabin, his wife, Martha, and their unborn son in a merciless blaze of orange and black. Since then, Arthur had become a man made of the same material he worked, hard, unyielding, and bearing the scars of fire. Grief was not a visitor in his house, it was the foundation. It had weight, settling in his shoulders and putting a permanent stoop in his powerful frame. The townsfolk knew him as a master smith, a man whose hands could coax strength and purpose from unwilling metal, but they knew little of the man himself. They saw the broad back bent over the anvil, the face perpetually smudged with coal dust, the eyes that held the flat, distant look of someone staring at a landscape only he could see. He spoke when necessary, his voice a low rumble like stones grinding together, but he offered nothing more. His silence was a wall, high and thick, and no one in Redemption Gulch had ever tried to scale it. His routine was a fortress against memory. He would rise before the sun, stoke the forge until it roared with a hungry breath, and then the work would begin. Horseshoes, wagon wheels, hinges, nails, the mundane necessities that held their small world together. He ate his meals standing, a hunk of bread and cured meat washed down with water from the pump. The small house behind the smithy was neat but achingly empty, a place for sleeping, not living. The ghosts there were quiet, but they were ever present, their whispers lost in the ceaseless Wyoming wind that howled around the eaves like a thing grieving with him. He was a man suspended in time, anchored to a past he could not escape, and with no vision for a future he did not want. One blistering afternoon, when the sun beat down on the dusty street with a merciless intensity, a new sound pierced the familiar symphony of his labor. It was not the creak of a wagon or the call of a merchant. It was the sound of a child crying. Arthur paused, his hammer held aloft, the glowing metal on his anvil hissing softly as it cooled. The sound was thin but persistent, a thread of pure, raw sorrow that snagged on the rough edges of his solitude. He tried to ignore it, to bring the hammer down and drown the noise in the righteous fury of his work, but the sound continued, punctuated by desperate, hitching breaths. It was a sound he hadn't heard up close in 4 years. A sound that belonged to a world he had long since bolted the door on. With a grunt of irritation, he set the hammer down. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the roar of the forge and the child's weeping. He wiped a hand across his sweat-slicked brow, leaving a streak of black soot, and stalked to the wide-open entrance of the smithy. There, just beyond the boundary of his shade, sat a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. Her dress a faded calico, her face streaked with dirt and tears. In her lap lay the source of her despair, a small wooden doll, its head snapped clean off its body. He watched her for a moment, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. A part of him, the hard, calloused part he had so carefully cultivated, wanted to turn around and walk away. It was not his concern. Nothing was his concern anymore beyond the fire and the steel. But another part of him, a deeply buried, long-forgotten piece, felt a dull ache. The sight of her small shoulders shaking with sobs was like a key turning in a rusted lock. "What is it?" he asked. His voice was rougher than he intended, a rusty tool pulled from disuse. The girl jumped, her crying momentarily ceasing as she looked up at him with wide, startled blue eyes, shimmering with unshed tears. She saw a giant of a man, dark and imposing, his shadow falling over her like a thundercloud. She shrank back, clutching the 2 pieces of her broken toy to her chest. He softened his tone, though it cost him a visible effort. Your doll? She could only nod, a fresh wave of grief threatening to overwhelm her. Arthur sighed, a gust of air that stirred the dust at his feet. He looked at the pathetic wooden figure, crudely carved and loved to the point of ruin. He thought of the small wooden horse he had once started carving, the one that lay unfinished in a locked chest at the foot of his bed. The memory was a sharp, painful jab. Without another word, he turned back into the forge. The girl watched, her fear warring with her curiosity. He picked up not a piece of wood, but a small, flat piece of scrap iron, no bigger than his palm. He thrust it into the glowing heart of the coals with a pair of long tongs. He worked the bellows, and the fire roared, bathing the metal in a furious, brilliant orange. For years, his work had been purely functional, devoid of art or whimsy. But now his hands moved with a different purpose. He pulled the glowing metal from the fire and laid it on the anvil. The first few blows of the hammer were loud, almost violent, as he flattened and shaped the iron. But then, his movements became more precise, more delicate. With a smaller hammer, he began to tap and curve the metal, his focus absolute. The little girl had crept to the edge of the smithy's entrance, her tears forgotten, her eyes round with wonder. She watched as, under the blacksmith's powerful, deliberate hands, the shapeless piece of iron began to transform. A head took shape, then a neck, a flowing mane, and 4 slender legs. It was a horse, captured in mid-gallop, its form simple but alive with energy. He plunged the small figure into the slack tub, and a furious hiss of steam erupted, a momentary cloud that smelled of hot metal and quenched fire. He pulled it out, the iron now a deep, dark grey, and turned it over in his calloused palm. It was rough, imperfect, but it was solid, it was strong, it would not break. He walked back to the entrance and crouched down, an immense effort for his stiff body. He held out his hand. "Here," he said, his voice still gruff, but carrying a different resonance now. The little girl rose, looked from his grimy, powerful hand to the small metal horse resting in it. Hesitantly, she reached out and took it. It was still warm, a pleasant weight in her small palm. She stared at it, her mouth slightly agape. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever seen. She looked up at the fearsome man, and for the first time she wasn't afraid. A watery smile broke through the teary mess on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, clutching her new treasure tightly, she turned and ran, her small legs kicking up dust as she disappeared down the street. Arthur watched her go, a strange hollowness in his chest. He stood up, his joints protesting, and returned to his anvil. He picked up his hammer, but the weight of it felt different. The silence of the forge pressed in on him again, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghost of a child's smile. He shook his head, trying to banish the feeling, and brought his hammer down, but the rhythm was broken. For the first time in 4 years, a crack had appeared in the walls of his fortress. 2 days passed. The sun rose and set, the wind blew, and Arthur worked. He tried to force the incident from his mind, to bury it under layers of sweat and exhaustion. He told himself it was a momentary lapse, a foolish whim. But every time he looked at the pile of scrap iron, he saw the small, empty space where the piece he had used had been. On the 3rd day, a woman appeared at the entrance to his forge. She was slender and wore a plain, mended black dress that spoke of mourning and poverty. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but a few stray strands had escaped to frame a face that was worn with worry, but possessed a quiet, determined strength. In her hand, she held the small metal horse. It was Eleanor Vance, a woman Arthur recognized by sight, but had never spoken to. He knew her story, as everyone in a town this small knew everyone else's. Her husband, a prospector, had been taken by a fever the previous winter, leaving her a widow with a young daughter to raise on her own. She stepped forward, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I believe this is your work." Arthur stopped hammering, resting the heavy tool on the anvil. He merely nodded, his eyes wary. He was not a man accustomed to social calls. My daughter Rose has not let it out of her sight, Eleanor continued. It was an act of profound kindness. I came to thank you. It was nothing, Arthur rumbled, eager to end the conversation and return to the familiar comfort of his work. A piece of scrap. To you, perhaps, she countered softly. To a little girl who has very little, it is a treasure, and to her mother, it is a sign. Arthur frowned. A sign of what? Eleanor took a deep breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the small toy. She was a woman who had weighed her options and found them all wanting, and had now arrived at the last and most desperate one. It is a sign of a good man, Mr. Blackwood, a man of substance, a man who, despite what whispers may say, has a capacity for decency. His eyes narrowed. He did not like where this was headed. The intrusion was becoming more than he could bear. State your business, madam. I have work to do. Her chin lifted, a gesture of defiance against the humility of her position. My business is survival, and perhaps yours is too, in a different way. I am a widow in this town. I have a child. I take in sewing and laundry, but it is a meager existence, and it is precarious. I have no protection. You are a man alone. You have a trade, a home. But you have no one to manage your household, to cook your meals, to offer the companionship that keeps a man from turning to stone. Arthur's face darkened. My household is my own affair. And it is killing you, she said, not with accusation, but with a startling, simple finality. It is hollowing you out from the inside. I can see it. Anyone can. He felt a surge of hot anger. You see nothing. I see a man who works until he collapses so he does not have to think, she pressed on, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve unbroken. I see a house that is clean but not a home, and I see a man who was kind to a crying child. That is the man I have come to speak with. She took another step forward, placing the metal horse on the edge of a workbench, a small, solid offering between them. I am here to make a proposal, Mr. Blackwood. A contract, a marriage. The word hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, dumbfounded. For a moment, he thought he had misheard, that the roar of the forge was playing tricks on his ears. But her expression was deadly serious. You're mad, he finally managed to say, the words rough and incredulous. I am practical, she corrected him. This would not be a marriage of hearts, Mr. Blackwood. I am not offering love, and I would not ask it of you. I am offering a partnership. I would be your wife in name. I would keep your home, cook your meals, mend your clothes. My daughter would have a roof over her head and the protection of a father's name. In return, you would have a well-run home and the normalcy of a family, which can be its own kind of shield in a town like this. It would be an arrangement of mutual benefit. A business contract, plain and simple. Arthur felt as if the air had been punched from his lungs. The audacity of it, the cold, stark logic, was staggering. She spoke of marriage as if it were a bill of sale for a wagon. He thought of Martha, of the love that had been as warm and vital as the sun, and a bitter, protective rage rose in him. To replace that with this transaction. No, he said, the word a piece of iron slammed onto an anvil. The answer is no. He turned his back on her, a clear and brutal dismissal. Get out of my forge. He heard her stand there for a long moment. He expected tears or pleading or an angry retort. Instead, there was only a quiet sigh. Very well, she said, her voice strained but dignified. But the offer stands. Should you find that your solitude is a heavier burden than a wife and child would be, you know where to find me. And then she was gone. Arthur stood with his back to the entrance, his fists clenched at his sides. He did not move for a long time, listening to the fire and the wind, the two sounds that had been his only companions. But now, a third sound echoed in the cavern of his mind, the quiet, steady voice of a desperate woman offering him a life he was certain he never wanted again. In the days that followed, Arthur tried to erase the conversation from his memory. He worked with a renewed ferocity, his hammer falling faster, harder, as if he could pound the woman's words into dust. But her proposal had planted a seed of awareness in him. He had lived in Redemption Gulch as if it were a desert island, but now his eyes were open. He started to notice things he had previously ignored. He saw Eleanor at the general store, her face tight with worry as she counted out her few coins for flour and beans. He saw the other women, the wives of merchants and ranchers, give her a wide berth, their looks a mixture of pity and suspicion. A widow alone was a disruption to the town's fragile order. But most of all, he noticed Garrett Shaw. Shaw was a man who owned a small, failing freight business and carried himself with the unearned swagger of someone who confused cruelty for strength. Arthur had seen him around, had shod his horses, and noted the man's impatience and rough hands. Now, he saw Shaw through a different lens. He saw the way the man's eyes lingered on Eleanor, a proprietary, predatory gaze that made Arthur's stomach clench. He saw him corner her near the mercantile, leaning in close, his voice low and suggestive. Arthur watched from the shadows of his forge as Eleanor stood her ground, her spine straight. But he could see the tremor in her hands as she pushed past him and hurried away, pulling little Rose tightly against her skirts. A cold, slow-burning anger began to smolder in Arthur's chest. It was a familiar feeling, this protective rage, but one he had not felt for anyone but Martha. To feel it now, for this stranger and her child, was deeply unsettling. He told himself it was just a sense of justice, an aversion to bullies like Shaw, but it was more than that. Eleanor's proposal, as clinical as it had been, had tethered them to him in some indefinable way. Her vulnerability was now a problem he couldn't ignore. The situation came to a head one evening as twilight bled across the plains. Arthur was cleaning his tools, the day's work done, when he heard a raised voice from down the street. It was Shaw's. And then he heard Eleanor's, sharp and afraid. "Leave me be, Mr. Shaw." Arthur dropped the rag he was holding. He moved to the entrance of the forge and looked out. Near the lane that led to the small rooms Eleanor rented, Shaw had blocked her path. He had a hand on her arm, his face flushed with drink and entitled aggression. "Now, Eleanor, don't be like that," Shaw was saying, his voice a greasy imitation of charm. "A pretty woman like you shouldn't be all alone. I can take care of you. You and the girl." "I can take care of myself," she shot back, trying to wrench her arm free. Little Rose was hiding behind her mother's skirts, crying silently. "Can you?" Shaw sneered, his grip tightening. "Don't think so. You need a man, a real man." Something inside Arthur snapped. The cold anger ignited into a white-hot flame. He strode out of the forge, his heavy work boots making no sound in the thick dust. He didn't run. He moved with the deliberate, inexorable force of a landslide. Shaw didn't see him until Arthur's shadow fell over them. He looked up, his sneer faltering as he took in the blacksmith's immense frame and the look of cold fury on his face. Arthur didn't speak. He simply reached out and clamped his hand around Shaw's wrist. It was not a violent grip, but it was absolute. Arthur's fingers were like bands of iron. The strength in that hand was born of years of swinging a heavy hammer, of bending steel to his will. Shaw's face went pale. He tried to pull away, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Arthur leaned in, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that was more terrifying than any shout. She said to leave her be. "This ain't your concern, Blackwood," Shaw stammered, his bravado evaporating. Arthur's grip tightened infinitesimally. A pained grunt escaped Shaw's lips. "She is not to be troubled again," Arthur said, his eyes boring into Shaw's. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. "Not by you. Not by anyone. Do you understand?" Shaw, his face slick with sweat, could only manage a frantic nod. Arthur held his gaze for a second longer, ensuring the message was received and branded onto the man's soul. Then he released him. Shaw stumbled back, cradling his wrist, and without another word, he scrambled away into the growing darkness like the coward he was. Silence descended. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and Rose's muffled sobs. Arthur turned to Eleanor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and luminous in the dim light. She was looking at him not with fear, but with a dawning, complex expression of shock, relief, and something more he couldn't name. He gave a stiff, formal nod. "Are you harmed?" "No," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Thank you." He felt an awkwardness settle over him. He had acted on pure instinct, and now, in the aftermath, he didn't know what to do. The protector's role did not come naturally to him anymore. "I will see you home," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He walked beside them, a silent, hulking guardian. The distance to her door was short, but it felt like miles. When they reached the dilapidated boarding house where she lived, Eleanor fumbled with the key, her hands still trembling. She finally got the door open and ushered Rose inside. She then turned back to Arthur, who stood on the worn stoop, looking as out of place as a granite boulder in a flower bed. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. The events of the evening had changed everything. His intervention was an answer, a declaration more powerful than any word he could have spoken. He looked at her, at the weary lines around her eyes, at the fierce, protective love she had for her child, at the dignity that clung to her like a second skin. He thought of his empty house, of the suffocating silence, of the long, lonely years stretching before him. Her proposal had seemed insane. Now, in the quiet of the night, it started to sound like the only sane thing in the world. It was a lifeline. For her, and maybe, just maybe, for him too. He met her gaze, his own expression solemn. He gave a single, curt nod. "The contract," he said, his voice low and final. "I accept." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears, but these were not tears of fear or sorrow. She simply nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the pact they had just sealed in the dusty twilight of a lonely frontier town. Their new life began with the quiet awkwardness of two strangers learning to share a space. Eleanor and Rose moved into Arthur's house the next day, their few, meager possessions fitting into a single trunk. The house, which had been a mausoleum of silence, was suddenly filled with new sounds. The soft pad of Rose's small feet on the wooden floors, the gentle hum of Eleanor's voice as she sang a lullaby, the clink of dishes being washed in the kitchen. For Arthur, it was a profound disruption. He retreated to his forge, his sanctuary, but the sounds of life seeped in under the door and through the walls. At first it was jarring, an unwelcome intrusion. He ate the meals Eleanor prepared in stiff silence, the food tasting strange and unfamiliar on his tongue, not because of its quality, it was simple but delicious, but because it was an act of care, a currency he had long stopped trading in. Eleanor was a ghost of quiet efficiency. She moved through his home with a respectful deference, cleaning away the years of dust and neglect, mending his torn work shirts, bringing order to his bachelor chaos without ever disturbing the sacred, untouched space of his bedroom or the locked chest that sat at the foot of his bed. She understood, without him having to say a word, that there were places in his house and in his heart that were not part of their contract. Rose was the bridge between their two islands of solitude. Children have no patience for the careful boundaries of grieving adults. She was fascinated by the forge, by the roaring fire and the shower of sparks. Arthur, at first, was stern, warning her to keep her distance, but her curiosity was relentless. He found himself explaining the tools, the different kinds of metal, the way fire could be both a creator and a destroyer. He forged another animal for her, a small, sturdy bear, and this time he let her watch from a safe distance, explaining each step in his low rumble. He saw the way her eyes lit up, and it chipped away another piece of the ice around his heart. Slowly, tentatively, a routine formed that was not his alone but theirs. He would rise and stoke the forge, and soon after, the smell of coffee and frying bacon would drift from the kitchen. Eleanor would bring him his breakfast, their hands sometimes brushing as he took the plate, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of unexpected awareness through him. In the evenings, they would sit in the main room. He would clean his tools or sharpen a blade, and she would sit with her sewing basket, the rhythmic pull of her needle, and thread a soft counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. They rarely spoke of the past. Their conversations were practical, revolving around supplies for the house or a wagon that needed repair. But in the shared silence, a new language was forming. It was in the way she knew to bring him a cool drink of water when the forge was at its hottest, in the way he started leaving scraps of wood by the hearth for her to use in the stove. It was a quiet architecture of mutual consideration, building a structure of reliance and respect around the stark framework of their contract. One evening, months after she had moved in, Arthur came in from the forge, weary to his bones. The house was quiet. He found Eleanor in the main room, asleep in her chair, her sewing fallen into her lap. Rose was already tucked into her small bed in the corner room. He stood for a moment, watching her. In the soft lamplight, the lines of worry on her face seemed to have eased. She looked peaceful. He felt an urge, strange and powerful, to pull the worn quilt from the back of the sofa and drape it over her shoulders. He took a step forward, then hesitated, his hand clenching into a fist. It felt like a line he was not yet allowed to cross. He retreated, leaving her to her rest. But the impulse remained. He was beginning to feel something more than duty, something more than the satisfaction of a contract upheld. He was beginning to care. The realization did not come like a lightning strike, but like the slow, inexorable dawn. The house was no longer just his shelter, it was their home. And these two strangers were no longer just his responsibility, they were becoming his family. The final wall around his heart crumbled one blustery autumn night. A storm raged outside, the wind shrieking like a banshee. Arthur was woken by a cry from Rose's room. He sat up, his heart pounding. He heard Eleanor's soothing voice, but the child's frightened sobs continued. He got out of bed and went to the door of her room. Eleanor was sitting on the edge of the cot, holding Rose, who was trembling from a nightmare. "It's all right, my love. It was just a bad dream," Eleanor murmured. Arthur watched from the doorway, a silent shadow. He saw the fierce, tender love in Eleanor's embrace, and it struck a chord deep within him, a chord of profound loss and an even more profound, burgeoning hope. He stepped into the room. Eleanor looked up, surprised. He crouched beside the bed, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. He reached out a hand, not to touch, but simply to offer his presence. He looked at Rose, his gaze gentle. "The wind sounds like a monster, doesn't it?" he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "But it's just air, pushing at the house. This house is strong. I built the hinges on those shutters myself. Nothing can get in." Rose's sobs quieted. She looked at his big, calloused hand, then up at his face. He wasn't the scary man from the forge anymore. He was Arthur. He was safety. He stayed until she had drifted back to sleep, her small hand clutching a corner of her blanket. Eleanor walked with him back into the main room. The storm still howled, but inside, the house felt safe and warm. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, her eyes shining in the dim light. This time, the words carried the weight of everything that had passed between them, the contract, the protection, the shared meals, the quiet evenings, the kindness to her child. "She is my daughter," Arthur said, and the words, once a legal fiction, now felt like the truest thing he had ever said. Eleanor reached out, her fingers hesitantly touching his forearm. It was the first time she had initiated contact. Her touch was light, but it burned through his shirt, right to his skin, right to his soul. "The contract said you would provide a home and protection," she said softly. It said nothing of kindness, it said nothing of patience, it said nothing of making her feel safe from monsters, real or imagined. He looked down at her small hand on his arm, and then he slowly, deliberately, covered it with his own. His hand was rough and scarred, hers was slender and worn from work, but they fit together. The marriage contract was fulfilled, but in its place, something far more real and infinitely more precious had grown. It had been forged not in a single fiery moment, but slowly, Over time, with patience and pressure and the unexpected alchemy of two lonely souls finding shelter in one another. The next morning, the storm had passed. Arthur stood at his anvil, the familiar weight of the hammer in his hand. But the sound it made was different. It was no longer the lonely toll of a man hammering against his grief. It was part of the music of a home, a rhythm that harmonized with the scent of baking bread from the kitchen and the sound of a little girl humming as she played on the floor with her family of small, strong, unbreakable metal animals. The fire in his forge still tempered steel, but its warmth had finally reached the house and the heart of the man who worked it. He was Arthur Blackwood, the blacksmith. But he was also a husband and a father. He was home.